Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my PhD defense. I have about 11 minutes to talk to you a little bit about what's in this book. And then we'll have the interrogation by the Inquisition, which is waiting outside behind this door. I'll start with a little analogy which does not come from the dissertation itself, which perhaps will give you a sense of what it is that sort of animated me to write a dissertation that looks like this. So in 1926, Ronald Fisher, perhaps the most influential, or very probably the most influential statistician at all from the whole history of statistics, he wrote a review for the Eugenics Review of a new book called The Need for Eugenic Reform by Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin. And he was very excited about this. He praised Leonard Darwin for his power of profound and wholly rational judgment and his even-handed treatment of all the arguments in favor of eugenics. And he said that it dealt very frankly and very well with the central problem of the elimination of the less fit with its equally difficult counterpart, the encouragement of the multiplication among the more fit. And he went through a couple of his own arguments in favor of eugenics, including saying that in no state of society, however unjust its institutions, can we imagine that it will not be the more able, the more industrious, and the more beautiful who find their way to the upper classes. And he said that it seems to him that the current English institutions of his day were designed to repress parenthood, I'm quoting, among the self-respecting, while encouraging boundless fecundity among the never-do-well or deliberately parasitic groups. So you might think this is a fluke, a one-off little deviation in the history of statistics, but you'd be wrong. There's in fact a whole history of something much more than a fling, more a long-term marriage between race biology and racist science in general and statistics in the 20th century. So for instance, Francis Galton, who's often cited as the father or the most influential early figure in British statistics, was a self-professed racist. He wrote in 1857 a news piece for the Times of London in which he said that he did not share in the belief that the African is our equal in brain and heart, and argued that this was an argument for upholding the institution of slavery in the British colonies. And he said that we have an equal right to utilize them to our advantage as the state has to drill and coerce a recruit. And for him, this was not just, the use of statistics was not just a parallel hobby that did not have anything to do with his project in race science. In fact, for him, statistics was a necessary means to provide a justification and a theoretical support for his race science. And he explained that the use, in the first ever issue of Biometrica, he had explained that the use of analysis of variance was a tool that could be used for converting a mob into an orderly array, like a regiment becomes a tactical unit. Right? So he's talking about arrays of actual numbers, but his rhetoric is sort of revealing the social organization he has in mind as well. And he commented in the race science journal Man that it's easy to indulge in utopias, including a vast system of statistical registration, but the pressing need is to establish a firm basis of fact for the roads that lead toward race improvement. The question of how much may reasonably be anticipated must be delayed until the problems that have been indicated are more or less satisfactorily solved. Okay, so for him, we stand in need of statistics because we have a racist project that needs to be implemented in society. And therefore, we need a discourse of truth, if you will, or we need a theoretical underpinning for this political project. And you find similar rhetoric in Carl Pearson, the other early founder of British statistics, which also says that statistics is a precursor for the theory of statistics is a precursor for the practice of eugenics. So there is something like a very old marriage here between race science and statistics. And why am I talking about this when that's not the topic of my dissertation? Well, because this illustrates very neatly, well, first of all, because I've been studying these people for one of the chapters in my dissertation, and I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but also because It's an analogy for the way that I look at these human sciences that I treat in the dissertation. When you think about logic, statistics, biology, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, they don't live in a vacuum. When people get seduced by the romance of a big narrative about what a human being is, or a narrative about what our fundamental characteristics are, like a Hobbesian story about our innate animal spirits, or a Rousseauian narrative about the romance of unconstrained society, these are political fantasies that are looking for theoretical underpinnings. They're looking for a language in which to be guised as science. And I think much of what we see when we open the box with human science is an attempt to find this kind of theoretical discourse of truth that can be used to glorify much of the political project. So just a slightly more contemporary example. This is from a 2009 book called The Female Brain. This is from the chapter on emotion, in which so the author is a medical doctor who has a self-help practice in which he does couples therapy, including hormone therapy, by the way. She explains here with a case story that why couples are different, saying, maneuvering like an F-15, a fighter jet. Sarah's female brain is a high-performance emotion machine, geared to tracking, moment by moment, the nonverbal signals of the innermost feelings of others. By contrast, Nick, like most males, according to scientists, is not as adept at reading facial expressions and emotional nuance, especially signs of despair and distress. And she has a 60-page list of footnotes for this book. It looks extremely impressive when you open it up. It's full of things like this and things that are even more crude than this, but apparently backed up by really solid neuroscience. There are references to all the current medical literature. I think this particular quote here is sourced by 2 different research journal articles. So obviously this is ridiculous, but it's not so obvious exactly why it's ridiculous and what to do about it. My approach has always been, that's not the only one, but that you need to fight this pseudoscience with a counter-science. You need to check those footnotes. You need to point out in the scientific detail why this is wrong and where it goes awry. In this specific case, I think from this quote, it's one of those cases where she cites 2 different studies, and then she summarizes the experimental setup from one and the conclusion from another one. So just merges those without comment. Other places, she just quotes them for things that are the exact opposite of the conclusion. In one case, she says that women have a better gut feeling than men, and she cites literally a study of women's guts, like people in an MRI scanner with irritable bowel syndrome. So when you actually check the footnotes, you can peel apart this pseudoscientific edifice, and you can construct a different narrative that shows why this is a highly selective and sometimes also decidedly wrong story. And this is what I've often tried to do, see something that to me just really reeks of being an ideological project in a disguise. And then, stay as calm as I can and find out where the pain point is and hammer away at that pain point. Really keep hacking until the whole building comes down. That's the project. So I've done that in a couple of chapters here. There's a couple of cognitive metaphor theory, one on the Chomskyan tradition of linguistics, which has recently acquired something that seems to be brain science evidence in favor of its traditional philosophical and metaphysical story about language. Then a couple that are on probability theory, and the last chapter here is the one where I studied the history of statistics and got to know Fisher very intimately. So I have like 2 minutes. Let me just show you a couple of examples here. So here about the 4th chapter, it's the notion that inside our heads is a machine for recognizing something like English, a grammatical structure that clearly defines the grammar of the English language, which cannot be analyzed by any other means than introspection. And then you find this testament by Robin Lakoff. Let me read the whole quote. She says, To show that language functioned in this way would be to make a deep claim about the logical capacities of the human mind, to give deeper and more rigorous meaning to the Cartesian claim that man was a reasoning animal, and that those formal rational capacities were intrinsic to and universal in, that is, provided a definition of humankind. So you can almost not get it more on record than this, right? It's allegedly linguistics. The official story is that we're studying grammar, but it's all part of a very self-conscious philosophical project of proving a certain rationalistic image of, well, in Robin Lakoff's term, man. You find something similar in her ex-husband, George Lakoff, who argues in much of his work on cognitive metaphor theory that we can essentially generalize across humanity because everybody has the same body, and therefore there will be universal tendencies in humankind. There are lots of things to be said about this. I do say a number of things. So for instance, I have a case study on blindness and how this affects, and in particular how it does not affect spoken language. And certainly there are testaments, including testaments from blind people, that show that this is decidedly not the case. All right, let me just skip the last one and proceed to the interrogation. Minutes. 50. Or it's a full hour total, right? And now it's supposed to be 11 minutes past. Yeah. Now comes the bells. She ran away at the altar.
Ladies and gentlemen, all rise, please.
Dames en heren, ik heet u allen van harte welkom bij deze bijzondere zitting van het College voor Promoties. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Amsterdam on the occasion of the PhD defense of Mr. Madsen. Dear candidate, to open the discussion, please read aloud the first part of the formula.
By authority of the Rector Magnificus and the Doctorate Board of this university, I shall, during this hour, in order to obtain the doctorate, publicly defend my thesis entitled The Kid, the Clerk, and the Gambler, Critical Studies in Statistics and Cognitive Science. I entreat all those who wish to voice their criticisms of the contents of this thesis to do so in a truthful and lucid manner, so as to provide an opportunity for an ordered exchange of views.
Thank you very much. I can inform you that during this ceremony, questions and answers will be in English. The official languages will be Dutch and English. I take the opportunity to thank the members of the board for having spent so much time to their important task and for being present here today. Thank you very much. I hereby introduce the first opponent, Professor Arianna Betty, hoogleraar taalfilosofie aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Tusind tak, Mathias, tillykke. For this very rich, I continued in English, that's what my Danish can do. For this very rich and well-crafted dissertation, which I enjoyed very much reading. I was impressed by the sheer amount of material you cover and the different fields you skillfully master. My question regards chapter 2, the notion of precision, in particular page 16, I hope the pages match, it's section 223, a reliability assessment method.
Yes.
You're looking there for a notion of precision for one of the practical jazz criteria, precise as opposed to vague. You write, I quote, in order to minimize my own part in this arbitrary choice, I decided to quantify the notion of precision by using the concept hierarchy in WordNet 3.0. For instance, the concept shame was given a precision score of 5, since the path connecting the corresponding WordNet concept to the root concept entity consists of 5 steps: shame, feeling, state, attribute, abstract entity, entity. I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on your choice of linking the precision, analysis of precision to the WordNet hierarchy. So the reason I'm asking this is the following. So as a philosopher, I read a fair amount of philosophical literature infused with intuitions. Okay? So with a puzzling emphasis on concept analysis based on reported intuition of a single agent, the author of the meaning of a certain common word in, say, English. The author often being a non-native speaker of academic English. Now, I find this literature pretty disturbing indeed for its arbitrariness and lack of objectivity. So I was quite happy to see what it did. So quite excited at first to see an alternative choice, alternative path chosen here. On a second thought, however, the particular alternative, so the exact choice you make, so the choice of WordNet, remains for me a methodologically risky one. WordNet is an ontology that is a shared, formal, explicit network of concepts. That is, known to harbor horrible conceptual confusions. Second, its bias towards a certain philosophical stance about reality, how we conceptualize it. And third, last but not least, the concept hierarchy can be, so in this case, can be considered a measure of generality, abstractness, the path you chose. So from shame to feeling, state, attribute, abstract reality, entity, and not a measure or analysis of precision. So could you elaborate a bit more on your, say, methodologically on your choice here? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting question. I completely agree that there's lots to be criticized about that, and WordNet is a very flawed database in many ways. So I guess the shortest possible answer to your question is, what else would I do? This was the working philosophy that led me to make this choice. I don't know exactly how you read the word precision, but let's say out in logical space you have some concepts that correspond to very tiny bubbles, some concepts that correspond to very big bubbles. We would like to select those that correspond to the smallest bubbles possible. What we have is just a partial ordering of the bubbles in terms of whether one is contained in the other. That doesn't translate one-to-one at all into actual size, but it's the best stand-in or best proxy I have for that actual measure that I'm interested in.
Thank you very much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Jan Willem Romein, hoogleraar Philosophy of Science van de Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. Unfortunately, he is not here, but his question will be read by Professor Stockhoff.
Quote, dear candidate, it's most unfortunate that I cannot be here in person on this festive day that concludes your PhD project. Fever prevents me from attending, which I sorely regret. But let me turn to more uplifting matters. Your thesis was an enjoyable read to me. You cover an exceptionally broad range of topics, and you have shown autonomy, originality, and daring in how all these topics are approached, as well as framed in a wider concept approach. My congratulations. Now to my questions, and there are three, the others be handed after. In chapter 6, you make a start with a particular view on combining probability theory with some material from multi-agent logic. Towards the end of the chapter, you suggest that the resulting framework is too versatile. The models it supplies cannot carry any explanatory form unless the framework comes equipped with further constraints on modeling. Truly, this is not something you can blame the framework for, or is it? The complaint sounds much like the complaint of a physicist who finds that the three-dimensional continuum, that is the mathematical model of physical space, is not restrictive enough because it still allows for all possible kinematics of massive bodies. Similar frameworks to the one you proposed, like Arsiani's type space or Halpern's knowledge structures, which I felt were unduly missing from the discussion, also offer a vast wealth of models, but arguably those frameworks have been used to construct explanatory models in epistemic game theory, behavioral economics, and beyond. So why would this versatility be a problem for your framework? Does it have a status or outlook that is different from the status or outlook of type spaces and knowledge structure?
Well, highly esteemed opponent and ghost of absent opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting question. So that's entirely true. It's exactly a complaint of that sort, that there's nothing necessarily wrong with the framework just because it's not constrained enough. But everything I do here does sort of ad hoc smuggle in different decision principles, which should, I think, if I had more time, if I had developed this would be a much more principled and much more general theory of how to combine decision principles with these knowledge structures. And so Jan Willem in absentia mentioned Hassani spaces, which do indeed do this, but they often do it so they add a specific decision principle, namely expected utility maximization. But this decision principle is often not seen as a particular choice that could potentially be varied. And I would like to see what the behavior would be like if you fix the belief representation, then you change the decision principle. And this is what I'm talking about in that last speculative section of that paper.
Thank you very much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Gerard Steen, hoogleraar taalbeheersing aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, let me put my metaphorical cards on the table from the beginning. Mine will be a fundamentally critical intervention. As you know, my field of expertise is metaphor studies, which is a topic you have addressed in the first 2 chapters of your dissertation. I'm afraid that these are the only 2 chapters in the thesis that I can evaluate. The other ones are all in totally different domains of expertise. This is testimony to the ambition of your study and was, of course, agreed beforehand between myself and your thesis directors. The committee as a whole has decided that you have succeeded in covering all of these territories to a sufficient degree for each of the distinct domains, for which I offer you my warm congratulations. How your 2 metaphor chapters can be assessed in this context is a question that I will return to in my second question if time permits. What is part of my position, however, is that I should be able to judge the relation between your two metaphor studies and the overall topic of your thesis. Here too, however, I have some difficulties, and this I find rather problematic. To be honest, I do not quite understand what the overall topic of your thesis is. I do not think that this is due to the nature of the overall topic, as I do know a little bit about statistics and a lot more about cognitive science. However, my problem is different. It concerns the way in which you have framed your complete set of studies. Your introduction is rather brief and general. I miss an overall problem statement, goal, research question, and approach. This might be part of your tradition in philosophy, but I'm not quite sure whether that is true or acceptable. What I find really problematic is the fact that you do not have a conclusion. Does this mean that there is no overall conclusion to be drawn from your studies? If there is not, that would be a first in all of the PhD theses I have seen defended and approved. And then I would like to hear your explanation of how and why this thesis is different. By contrast, if there is an overall conclusion, then I wonder what it is, but what is more important, then I would really like to ask you why you did not formulate this in words for the reader to take in and especially critically assess. This is especially surprising for an author who is as critical of you as you of the way other researchers employ statistics and think about the borders of human rationality. Of all people, I think it should have been you to live up to your own high standards, which includes drawing general conclusions in explicit fashion. Only in this way can researchers from the diverging range of different domains that you present in between these two covers evaluate how your studies make a contribution to establishing one and the same overall point. In other words, can you explain to me what your overall research project is about and how the metaphor study should be read as contributing to that? And can you explain why you did not present the studies nor the project as a whole in these integrating terms? I look forward to your answer.
Yes. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting question. I think the writing style that you mentioned is not so much one that comes from philosophy, but one that comes more from mathematics. My hero in this respect is perhaps I.L. Rubinstein, who once said that if you read the actual paper, you will never actually need the conclusion. And I have a show don't tell philosophy of writing in general. I think if sometimes when you look at a picture, the picture is more important than the comment you give on the picture. And this is the working philosophy that I've been trying to use as much as possible in writing this. So there are some quite deliberate choices in terms of how explicit I am. I think, so this is part of the reason why there's no philosophy in this dissertation, you could say, in one sense. That I think it's better in general to do your philosophy by example than it is to do it by abstract meditation, say. So I've been trying to use little pinpricks of case studies in specific sciences to make that point. And then the literary intention was that the cumulative effect of these pinpricks would add up to a punch. And the very brief introduction is written as, well, I needed to add as much explicit deliberation as would be appropriate. And those 3 pages, I think, give you a sense of the rhetoric in my head that produced these specific ones. But let's be more concrete then. So the metaphor chapters are, so there are different cartoon figures in different chapters, right? As I mentioned, they each have highly specific, highly biased perspective on what human cognition is, what a thought is, whether there is such a thing as thought, and what rationality means. In cognitive metaphor theory, you get a very specific, relatively modern version of that, which is related to the recent trend of embodied cognitive science, which I have a problem with because of its tendency to overemphasize this physicalistic basis of thought. And specifically, I have a problem with it for its emphasis to, for its tendency to overemphasize to an extreme degree the similarity between people and the experiences that different people have, which is part of the reason why the cover looks like this also. So when I discuss gardening or the changing role of the Catholic Church in terms of the, in relation to the changes in the English language, or when I discuss sailing, or when I discuss the effect of blindness or left-handedness, these are all specific ways of demonstrating how you can get seduced by the rhetoric of cognitive metaphor theory to forget that we have differences, bodily and existential differences, and these matter in linguistics. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. So you could say on a just slightly higher methodological point, I'm also trying to make a critique of the way that this literature has looked in general. So now I'm talking particularly about the second chapter in cognitive metaphor theory, that often I've found that there's been a lack of critical scholarship, essentially, about the claims that have been flung around. Some of the things I quote from Lakoff and Johnson, I had one master's student here that told me after she read this chapter that she was amazed that anybody could get past peer review saying things like that. And I have a little bit that same sense too sometimes when I read what Judge Lakoff says out loud. He will cite, for instance, Narayanan's PhD dissertation about, he has this computational model of of walking, right, that he uses to, in his own interpretation, build a reasoning system that can interpret movement metaphors. But when you actually look at this PhD dissertation, it consists of 9 example sentences that he deals with by building a system that can output a certain meaning representation that he hand inspects. Then he edits the system when it doesn't get the right result, and eventually he comes to something that he personally finds satisfying as a result. And this is in Jerome Feldman's word, the poster child for the neural theory of language. So for me, that calls for skimming a little bit through the footnotes and looking what is the actual evidence you have for this, because grand claims are being made about humankind. Grand claims are being made about, or in one phrase, how we think, as you know, and this, to me, is very provocative when somebody tells me how I think, or how my neighbor thinks. And I find that the quality of the argument is extremely poor, especially in that book, How We Think. Well, I hope you sort of see what it is that animates this. It's an anchor that comes from the same source about some of the other things that I look at from a critical perspective, namely the overgeneralization that for me comes from a specific romance of thought, or romance of philosophical anthropology.
I agree completely with your criticism of conceptual metaphor theory. I'll come back to that if I have time in my second question. But the fact that you get angry because somebody tells you how to think is a mirror image of what I would like to happen in a dissertation or in science in general, namely that people tell me what the author wants us to think so that I can actually critically agree or disagree. And that is something that I think you are not doing in your thesis, because you're not pulling together all those threads. I wonder how the other colleagues in the committee can actually judge what you're saying about metaphor studies if they're not inside metaphor studies, just like I can't judge what you're saying about the other chapters, if you do not pull all of those comments together in a framework that is the same for all of these studies. And that is what I'm missing. And when you say this is part of the philosophical tradition where you do this on a chapter-by-chapter basis, I'm wondering whether your pinpricks actually hit the audience all the time that you launch them.
Well, so...
Okay, a short, very short reaction, then we turn to the next
okay.
opponent.
Well, maybe. You're not getting a medium long one. Yeah, that'll be it. We'll get back in the next round.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the opposition will be continued by Dr. Jelle Zuidema, universitair docent computationele taalkunde en cognitiewetenschap aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. Please proceed.
Yes, so I've been impressed by your book, your dissertation in several ways. I mean, the sort of personal characteristics that come to mind when you read through this is stubbornness and courage. And I think, I mean, we've already seen that stubbornness and courage in the previous slide. But I do really appreciate what you're trying to do. So one of my personal frustrations with strong interest in philosophy is that a lot of philosophy of science sort of remains in their own character. They work with their own examples from the sciences that sometimes become a bit artificial. And there's too little sort of fruitful interaction going on. And it takes brave people to go and sort of actually deal with real issues that apparently any different science is going on. But these brave people, they will suffer the consequences because the norms in different scientific fields are extremely different, and sort of like meeting norms in both fields is very difficult. So and we need pioneers like yourself, but you not make things easy for yourself. So an example of that is chapter 4, which I think is really the most exciting chapter. So here's a long discussion about in cognitive neuroscience about the relevance of this sort of particular electrical signal that you find in EEG when processing sensitivity and for movement and system. And I think you do sort of an admirable, clear job of sort of like summarizing, showing that discussion and how this is going back and forth. And then at the end of it, sort of you conclude with the early excitement that here we've got a neural equivalent of this sort of semantics distinction. Was in hindsight very naive. And you come with a sort of like I very much like you come with a sort of an alternative sort of possible explanation of what's going on. So my question is like, although it's great that you've managed to find a model that sort of that does some justice to the input, and that conclusion that mapping, that assuming that this mapping is a bit naive, wasn't that a conclusion you could have drawn already before? And is this at all how we should understand, sort of like how we should understand? Imagine the relation between neuroscience and say linguistics. You proceed that sort of like linguistics comes up with a few dichotomies between syntax and semantics, between phonology, between morphology and syntax, and neuroscientists will go and find the neural equivalent of that dichotomy. Or is that program a naive program?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your interesting question. First, I think everybody's been able to see for about 10 years that there was something squeaking in that theory. And it's just been adding up that, you know, more and more examples at a more and more fundamental level have shown that this just can't be the explanation. There's just way too much wrong with it. That's an answer to the first way you formulated the question. Did we really need a new theory to see that this was wrong? And I don't think we did. I think most people knew that you know, you had to be quiet about this because something wasn't quite working. Then you asked the same question in a slightly different manner, which was, should we really conceive of the relationship between linguistics and neuroscience like this, like a vampiric relationship where linguistics suck out brain talk from neuroscience and then uses that to embellish its own scientific standing. And, well, I think not, but I think linguistics were very much like that, because it does, linguistics has been continually in an identity crisis for 100 years, right? And it's been trying to fight off philosophy, not look anything like that, or like philosophy of language, and it's been trying to, carve out a space for itself and become a respected scientific discipline. And when you reread the history of linguistics in those terms, it's clear how much effort is spent just carving out a scientific space and saying we have something called data, and we have something called a theory, and they're just as good as your theories. And I think it's in that, whether or not that's a good reason, that's the cause for this relationship that we're observing, and I don't think it's about to go away. I think linguistics likes when it can mobilize neuroscientific evidence for its own purposes. And neuroscience kind of likes when it can say, well, we solve problems in philosophy, in linguistics, in anthropology, and so forth, and it'll show up somewhere as the number 3 item on that list. So I think there's a kind of rhetorical symbiosis going on there. So if I could make that case, I'd like to break that symbiosis. But I don't think that's a realistic project. I think the best I can do is to pick up a case study like this and show that this was a dumb idea in a specific instance.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jakub Szemanik, universitair hoofddocent Logica en Cognitiewetenschap aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. Please proceed.
Yes. Really impressive in terms of the range of topics, and I really enjoyed reading it. And very brave, and it really shows true interdisciplinary spirit and a very broad knowledge of cognitive science. But I'm also actually missing a bit of the punchline, or a bit of the sort of conclusion, maybe, and especially when it comes to the status of your models. So many parts of your thesis are critical, so you critically investigate the work of others, but in chapter 4 and chapter 6 you actually propose your own computational models. And as Jelle asked about chapter 4, I would like to ask specifically about chapter 6. And in this chapter 6, what you do, you integrate logical and probabilistic approaches to the theory of mind and provide the computational models for a few common tasks of theory of mind. Mm-hmm. And first of all, I must say, I really think it's a great idea to try to actually bridge between these two traditions, so I completely agree with the intentions. However, you don't confront the model with experimental data, and you also don't give any specific predictions, I think. So I'm sort of not sure how to think about your models. So is it an explanatory model or explanatory models, right? Because they are not really predictive models. But if yes, in what sense they do better than respective Bayesian or logical models? Right, so if I were to take a cognitive science perspective, I would say that the most urgent task concerning theory of mind is the sort of developmental question. So what cognitive change is necessary to pass the force belief task, and related processing question, right, what are the cognitive resources at play? And indeed, logical, and I would say also Bayesian models, they both fail to provide an answer to that question, and there are many reasons. So you can mention that this is due to sort of common idealizations, right? Like looking at sort of external modeler's perspective, and that often implies logical omniscience in case of logical models, or paying not enough attention to the underlying computational structure, right? So just sort of trading flexibility of your formulas for sort of its complexity or plausibility. But then my impression was that your framework actually also sort of adopts this idealization. So I was not sure to what extent your framework can help on this front, either on this front of cognitive science. So, yeah, I was wondering what's your answer?
Yes. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting question. The intention was in this chapter to do something like give an illustration of how a specific toolbox works. And I quite deliberately did not make any grand claims about how well this would work as a model of human cognition. This is partly because I just don't know, but it's also partly because this is being a toolbox, this is not a theory. Like, probability theory is not a theory of human cognition. You can build anything with it. You can, you can construct a little neural network out of these representations. You can construct a logical model that doesn't have any probabilities. You can do whatever you want. And this means that either you go into a really large metaphysical project about, like Noah Goodman's saying that the mind is a Bayesian machine, and we think in a stochastic programming language of thought, and this is way too much for a chapter of this scope, and it's probably also wrong. And so I wanted to avoid these. So this is a more playful version of that, where I, without making any specific ontological claims about the realism of this model, you can show off what the model can do, and then it may be a good or a bad model in specific instances. So the intention was really to take something that's well developed in game theory and elsewhere, and then show how it can be implemented in a user-friendly way in cognitive science. That said, though, I was, of course, interested in getting to page 127 and 128 and showing that figure, because it seems important to me that some of these things that you asked about in development, that you can actually get this kind of transfer learning over long periods of times from a series of isolated instances, right, where you face a specific situation. And I think I don't know if development works like this, but I'm not going to buy into some innateness model before this has been excluded, right? Because it seems like a very attractive model of many developmental changes in the child. So I wanted to discuss that too. But other than that, the intention was really to give a tutorial on a specific modeling language.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the opposition will be continued by Dr. Dan Lasseter from Stanford University, USA. He's not here, unfortunately, but this question will be read by Professor van Lambalgen.
Dear candidate, I have to ghost for Dan. I found the proposed measure of relevance in Chapter 5 very interesting. This was disappointed by the lack of applications in natural scenarios, such as one would typically find in the literature on decision theory or linguistic mathematics. For instance, your section 535 is labeled non-cooperative pragmatics, but the example is fairly contrived and at least not obviously relevant to linguistic pragmatics. Could you propose one or two specific applications and explain how this measure of relevance compares to existing measures of relevance, such as value of information? Do you think that this concept can be used to analyze the intuitive concept of relevance across the board, or will there be classes of applications where another measure performs better?
Okay, highly esteemed candidates, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting question, and thanks to the ghost of Dan Lasseter too. So those were really three questions, I think. So one was, why not talk more about pragmatics or game theoretical decision theoretical pragmatics? And I could have done that. I was briefly toying with the idea of maybe writing a short paper applying this to something more linguistics related, but I was bored and wanted to do something else, so I didn't. Then there's the issue of how contrived it is, and well, I agree it's a toy model, but it's not more a toy than any other model you'll find in economics or pragmatics. I must add, at least of the kind of pragmatics that lives in the palm trees at Stanford. How does it compare? Well, there's an obvious mathematical answer, which I do discuss in the chapter. So if the question is something more like how does it compare in terms of prediction or behavioral prediction, then this is a complicated issue, and there are some behavioral findings that are not explained away by swapping this measure of relevance for the conventional one. There are some that are. So it will not have universal applicability if you want to use it as a cognitive or behavioral model, I think.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by our guest opponent, Professor Dr. Peter van M. de Boas, Emeritus Lector in de Mathematische Informatica aan de Universiteit van Amsterdam. Please proceed.
Esteemed defendants, when I was a week ago sitting here representing the rector, I acquired a copy of your thesis and I've been reading it with great pleasure. I think it's a nice example of what we expect from a scientist. Not just generate your own ideas, but do it by first looking what's there in the field, criticizing it, attacking the weak spots, and then coming forwards with new ideas. You'll stand upon the criticism of others. You'll have to see. You have been under attack here, and I can imagine you will be attacked much more based on the firm positions you are taking. But I like this. I have a question about the 5th chapter. The concept of meaningful information has been a target for various researchers over the past decades. My colleagues Adriaans and Vitagni have been attempting to define this concept in the context of Kolmogorov complexity theory. And based on all the papers I'm seeing, serving on various program committees which are discussing these things, and I'm not more myself, but I see a lot of it. The overall tone is that all these attempts are suffering fundamental problems in the sense that they fail to capture the intent concepts they are designed to capture. So it was a big surprise for me to reach the 5th chapter, which presents itself as providing a solution to this problem, which my colleagues so far seemed unable to solve. Now, from a mathematical perspective, we know that there are these close connections between mathematics behind and the mathematics behind Shannon formalism you are using. So my question is, have you bounded about this connection, whether your ideas can be translated to the other framework and help find a solution there, or is this particular ingredient of adding some sort of utility theory in your perspective something which cannot be transferred to the other side and therefore creates fundamental problems?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your interesting question. There are indeed very intimate connections between probability theory, information theory, and on one hand, and Kolmogorov complexity on the other hand. And everything I say about conventional Shannon information, that chapter translates very painlessly to the language of Kolmogorov complexity. However, I do get more out because I put more in there. As you mentioned yourself, there are utility functions here. And just having the plain probability model will flatten this and turn it into Shannon information theory. So if you want to extend this to a framework where you think in terms of non-deterministic machines rather than probability models, then that non-deterministic machine will somehow, there'll have to be an agent with utilities somewhere in the model. Otherwise, it's not going to fly. So it's more expensive to get this kind of measure because you need one more mathematical component before you get this out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now there is some time left for a second round of questions. I start with Professor Steen.
Dear candidate, My second question is about the point of your two metaphor studies as metaphor studies in the context of your thesis as a whole. As critical studies of conceptual metaphor theory, both chapters seem to broach a rather specific topic. I would summarize that as follows, and I wonder whether you agree. Semiotic data about metaphor, either linguistic or gestural, do not seem to match one-on-one with the complexities of human behavior. This is a point which I fully endorse. In fact, it's been made quite frequently in the literature over the past 2 decades. The Prageljazz group, for instance, was founded 15 years ago to develop the metaphor identification procedure you attack in Chapter 1 on precisely this premise. In 2007, I published a book-length study reviewing theories and research of finding metaphor in language and usage, which is entirely based on this tension between language structures and language processes. And it was in particular based on the idea that metaphor is always metaphor to somebody, which precisely deals with your interest in variation. References that you do include in your own reference list, such as Gibbs 2005 and 2011, make the same point and refer to related literature. Gibbs has called this the structure-process fallacy. Your conclusion in your first chapter says that the dictionary is no psycholinguistic model of how the mind processes metaphor. And this is precisely what all of this research has argued as well. The point of a metaphor identification procedure was not to build and test such a model at all. Instead, it was to address a methodological problem in semiotic metaphor research and increase its reliability in order to enable better interaction with psychologists and proceed with work on the structure-process fallacy. I think you have missed this point entirely. You have not applied its purport to your own chapter on metaphor in gesture either, where you do not report reliability figures for your analyses, which can be criticized regarding their accurateness, as has been the major linguistic problem with conceptual metaphor theory since its inception, why all of this methodological research was launched. In sum, your chapters therefore make a point that was made by many cognitive scientific and psychological critics of CMT before, but you do not discuss this debate nor relate the value of your own findings to it. You do not discuss the limitations of your own two empirical metaphor studies as standalone empirical studies either. I'm looking forward to your defense against these observations and your own critical assessment of your own two metaphor studies.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your interesting question. As regards to relating this to existing literature, this is what I do in chapter 2.1. Right? There's an overview both of existing literature defending cognitive metaphor theory and of the last 50 years of history of criticizing this. And I think it does point to how I'm positioned in this space of existing literature. As regards to the notion of a process structure fallacy, I'm quite explicit also in the same chapter that I'm talking about online thought, that this is the topic of it. And it's not true that Gibbs has put that issue aside or that he somehow gets away from this. He does say things to that effect occasionally, explicitly, but one page later he'll say the exact opposite. So for instance, in his 2012 book, he goes through several different examples and says that, for instance, when we have the phrase lying through his teeth, this is because we have an intuitive sense that that spit is valuable and you're hiding it behind your teeth, and this is the processing that goes on in your head. Or he says when the Bantu word for six means jump, then that's because you think about jumping from one hand to the other when you get there. So he says a lot of nice things in chapters 1, but then he goes right back to making the exact same mistakes, and we have to start all over again. So when I continue this criticism, it's because I don't see these being addressed. I see lots of rhetoric, but not scientific implementation of it.
The discussion is closed now. I request the candidate to read the second part of the formula.
Having thus concluded the defense of my thesis to the best of my ability, And pending the decision of the doctorate committee, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to my highly esteemed supervisors in particular, as well as to those who have so courteously brought forward their criticisms, and to all who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
Now the committee retires for deliberations.